Another Democratic presidential hopeful has dropped out of the race. Former Housing and Urban Development Secretary Julin Castro announced by video today he's suspending his campaign. Castro was the only Latino candidate in the field and focused on issues like immigration and poverty. Well, there are now still 14 Democratic candidates left in the race. We're 32 days away from the Iowa caucuses, and candidates have begun releasing new fundraising numbers for the fourth quarter. For the latest on the race 2020, I want to bring in Caitlin Huey-Burns and Joel Payne. Caitlin's our CBSN political reporter, and Joel is our political contributor and Democratic strategist. So, Caitlin, why now? Why did he decide to drop out of the race?
Well, he was really facing a reality, which is that we're a month away from the Iowa caucuses. He wasn't getting the polling that he needed or the fundraising that he needed to make the debate stage and to really stay in this race. So because we're getting into crunch time now for a lot of these campaigns, you're going to see candidates reassessing kind of where they are, whether they have the fuel to get through to Iowa and perhaps beyond. So you're going to start to see this, and it was really a recognition. And I think the timing is important because he has left a mark on this race. You mentioned immigration reform. He was the first candidate to come out with a comprehensive plan, and the first on some other issues as well. And by leaving now, he's also garnered a lot of praise from his fellow candidates, and a lot of Democrats think he'll be a player in the party in some way. So by getting out now, he kind of is able to kind of save face a little bit and could, be some kind of a factor in the future.
Joel Castro was one of the candidates who called on the DNC to actually change their rules to qualify for debates after a lack of diversity. What does Castro's departure do when you talk about the issue of diversity, particularly in the Democratic field?
Well, look, it's obviously not the diverse field that we saw when it began. You had people like Kamala Harris, Cory Booker still in the race, Julián Castro just dropped out. You had a historically diverse field. You still have Andrew Yang. You still have women like Amy Klobuchar and Elizabeth Warren, near the top of the polls. So there's still certainly diversity in the field, but not the diversity that we entered the field with. I think for a lot of Democrats, this is tough because if you look at the last two cycles, Hillary Clinton, first woman ever nominated major party nominee for president. Barack Obama, first African-American nominated. Both Democrats. I think Democrats somewhat, if you could say, got spoiled with the idea of making history. I think obviously that's probably less likely to happen now, although Elizabeth Warren and Amy Klobuchar might quarrel with that. But overall, I think Democrats feel good about the field, even if it's not the diverse field that they had when they entered.
Caitlin, when you talked about how this is really crunch time at this point, and you might see more people dropping out, anyone else that you think could be next at this point?
Well, it's pretty remarkable because we have had a lot of dropouts, but we still have one of the biggest Democratic fields that we've seen. I'm looking at people that have not been making the debate stage, and remember, we're coming up to a critical time where that threshold will have to be met. Only 5 candidates have made the next debate in Iowa later this month, and so that shows a winnowing in and of itself. So candidates like a Michael Bennet or a John Delaney, who is still in this race as well, they've been really kind of camped out in Iowa and haven't really seen the returns on those investments now. And then when you look at the debate cutoff, whether that forces any campaigns to reassess where they are and whether they have the viability to continue. Someone like a Cory Booker, who didn't make the last stage, hasn't made the next stage yet. Does that sort of either it could cut off some candidates or it might fuel underdog campaigns? But I think that's kind of where we'll see some shifts.
Another way to gauge viability or numbers, fundraising numbers.
Can
Yeah,
I add
please,
one
Joel.
thing to what Caitlin just said?
Yes.
Yeah, and I think Caitlin made a great point in her first answer talking about Castro and his ability to be a player in the future, and specifically as a VP nominee. I think he is one of 4 Democrats who's most likely to be the vice presidential nominee, given who's at the top of the field right now. I think it's Julián Castro, Kamala Harris, Cory Booker, Stacey Abrams. And when you think about the fact that Democrats are going to need a woman or a person of color to round out the ticket, I think those 4 people, in a lot of Democrats' mind, people who I've talked to, they feel like that's the leading field of VP contenders. And I do think Julián Castro has preserved his positioning in that race.
Joel, while you mentioned VP, I want to talk you a little bit about what Joe Biden had to say, that potentially he would pick a vice president that's a Republican. Where did that come from?
Oh, well, that's Joe Biden being Joe Biden, Rena. I mean, look, I think there's a couple things going on here. One, the former vice president wants to signal that he's going to be the type of leader of the ticket and eventually president that's going to bring people together and that's going to bring Democrats and Republicans together. I don't know if you can take Joe Biden literally here. I would take him figuratively. I think what he's saying is, I want to create an administration and I want to create an agenda that welcomes Republicans back in, welcomes those folks who are nervous Trumpers or who are people who felt alienated by the Republican Party. I want to welcome those folks back in. So I think that's what the former vice president was saying, more than actually saying that he's going to pick a Republican. If you'll even look at his answer, he says, there's not a Republican I have in mind right now. So I think this is where you take Biden figuratively and not literally.
Translating Biden. I'm not going to have you do that, Caitlin. But I do want to go back to the numbers point that I was trying to make about these fundraising numbers. I want to pivot to that. Bernie Sanders so far has topped the field. $34.5 million in Q4.
Yeah, that is
what does that mean?
A lot of money, especially given how many candidates are still in this race. And that signifies a couple of things to me. First and foremost, Bernie Sanders' base of support has been with him since 2016, and it is continuing on with him. So these Democratic rivals know that you underestimate Bernie Sanders at your own peril. This is someone who, given that fundraising haul, given that strong base of support, is going to be in this race for a long time. Yeah. And it's something that we don't really talk about when we talk about the front runners. You know, we often talk about Joe Biden or this rivalry between Buttigieg and Elizabeth Warren, but Bernie Sanders has been consistent in his lead in the top tier of candidates for the past several months. The other interesting thing to me was that the campaign says they got over 40,000 new donors. So that is answering some kind of question that we've been asking, which is, can Bernie Sanders expand his coalition, expand his base of support? The campaign says that they've been attracting new donors to the field. And the most important thing about this number is that these are small dollar donations. So about $18, I think, was the average contribution in this haul. That means that Sanders can keep going back to these supporters, go back to this kind of reservoir of support, and have that money there for him in the long run. Contrast that with someone like Joe Biden, who has been holding bigger dollar fundraisers, Pete Buttigieg as well to some extent. That is a little more of a challenge when you kind of max out some of these contributors, and that's something that why Democrats have been focused on this grassroots appeal.
You know, Joel, I've got to ask you about the Trump campaign numbers, their Q4 numbers, $46 million, and they've got $102 million in cash on hand. Cash is king. It matters in these campaigns. There's no way to deny that. Should Democrats be alarmed by these numbers that the president's been able to haul?
Not at all. This is, look, and you look at the field of Democrats versus what President Trump is raising. It actually, Democrats have to feel good about how much money between the leading candidates they're raising. The assumption would be that when you get down to one or two or three candidates, that number is going to be very comparable to what the president has. And obviously, when you have a nominee, that there's going to be enough support there. I just think we're talking a little bit too much about money here. It matters kind of in the aggregate. It matters that Bernie Sanders is flexing his muscles and demonstrating strength. But all of these candidates are going to have enough money to run a competitive campaign. Nobody who is going to be going up against Donald Trump is going to be cash poor. A lot of Democrats are going to circle around whoever that nominee is, and they will have plenty in their war chest to combat Donald Trump. I think Donald Trump is an incumbent president. Barack Obama, if you look at his numbers in 2011, 12, and 2008, leading up to the election, I'd bet you that they're comparable, compared to the rest of the field as well.
One thing that money does allow the Trump campaign to do, though, is run a general election campaign from the start. So one thing that I think it is notable, Bernie Sanders' haul does reassure some Democrats that the money is still out there, certainly. But what Trump has been doing for the last, year and a half or so, while the Democrats have been duking it out in the primary, and a primary that, frankly, figures to continue for a long time, given there's no clear frontrunner or leader at this point. He's able to run ads on Facebook. He's able to, go to voters with a very specific message, and Democrats still have to coalesce around someone. So it does give him an advantage in that way.
Caitlin, Huey-Burns, Joel Payne, thank you both very much.